These pranks didn't just go wrong. They triggered the worst kind of retaliation, from an air horn ending up in the prankster's own mouth to fake ashes that convinced a grieving son his mother's remains had been scattered into a pond. Welcome back. You're watching Fatal Files. It was April 18th, 2016. Spring had arrived in Indianapolis, Indiana, bringing warmer weather and plenty of backyard cookouts and garage get-togethers. For one group of friends, those weekends almost always involved someone filming prank videos, each one trying to get a bigger reaction than the last. Spencer Nolan was 26 years old and worked at a distribution warehouse just outside the city. He had known most of the group since high school and was easygoing, which made him the favorite target whenever someone wanted a reaction. One prank in particular kept coming back. Chase Simmons, 25, one of Spencer's longtime friends, had bought a handheld air horn and carried it to almost every gathering. What started as an occasional blast from across the yard gradually turned into Chase, sneaking up behind Spencer and sounding it just inches from his ear while someone recorded the reaction. Maybe I'm just getting older, but I've never understood what's funny about making someone's ears ring for a laugh. Over the following weeks, the jokes became more frequent and harder to avoid. Chase would wait until Spencer was distracted, whether he was grilling, loading his truck, or looking at his phone, before setting off the air horn. Friends later said Spencer had stopped laughing about it. He often kept his distance from Chase and had made it clear more than once that he wanted the pranks to stop, but nobody took the complaints seriously because he had never reacted violently before. I think we've all known someone who gets picked on because they're the one who always lets it slide. Sometimes people mistake that for being okay with it. That afternoon, several friends gathered at a detached garage behind one of their homes. Music played from a speaker on a shelf while people moved between the driveway and the backyard. Spencer was standing at a workbench sorting through a toolbox, facing away from everyone else, and Chase decided to pull what he later intended to be the last prank of the day. Instead of sounding the air horn beside Spencer's ear like he usually did, Chase stepped in close and pressed the end of the horn directly against Spencer's mouth before squeezing the trigger. The blast echoed through the enclosed garage. Spencer immediately stumbled backward, coughing and grabbing at his mouth and ears as everyone nearby instinctively flinched from the deafening noise. Before anyone had time to react, Spencer grabbed the air horn out of Chase's hand. Holding the metal canister by its base, he swung it toward Chase's head. The first strike knocked Chase off balance and onto the concrete floor. Spencer continued striking him while Chase tried to shield himself with his arms. Friends rushed in almost immediately, but in the tight space around the workbench, it took several seconds before they were able to pull Spencer away. By then, Chase was unconscious and bleeding heavily from multiple head wounds. One friend called for help while another began first aid, following instructions given over the phone until responders arrived. The garage floor showed clear signs of the struggle, including blood spatter near the workbench and the damaged air horn lying several feet away. Investigators also recovered multiple cell phones from the scene. More than one had been recording at the moment the prank occurred, providing a clear timeline of what happened before, during, and immediately after the assault. Chase died from severe blunt force injuries to the head. The death was ruled a homicide. Investigators recovered multiple cell phone recordings showing the prank and the assault, along with witness statements confirming Spencer had been the target of similar pranks for weeks. Prosecutors argued Spencer continued striking Chase after he was no longer a threat, while the defense maintained he acted in the heat of passion immediately after the prank. A jury ultimately found Spencer guilty of voluntary manslaughter, and he was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Sometimes, the biggest mistake isn't pulling the prank. It's assuming the person on the receiving end is going to react the way they always have. Over 1,000 miles west in a Colorado park, a man pretending to steal a recovering dog would soon find himself on the receiving end of the very leash meant to protect it. It was September 9th, 2017. Early fall had arrived in Boulder, Colorado, bringing cooler mornings and comfortable afternoons. Parks across the city were busy with joggers, families, and plenty of people walking their dogs. It was the kind of Saturday where nothing seemed out of the ordinary. at least not at first. Jeffrey Mason was 38 years old and had owned golden retrievers for most of his adult life. His current dog had recently undergone surgery after tearing a ligament in one of its back legs. The recovery had gone well, but Jeffrey still followed every precaution. Their walks were shorter than they used to be, and the dog stayed on a retractable leash until it had fully healed. I don't know about you, but if my dog had just recovered from surgery, I'd probably be watching it like a hawk too. That afternoon, Jeffrey stopped near a bench to let the dog sniff around a grassy area beside one of the walking paths. As another dog passed nearby, it suddenly became startled and jerked hard enough that Jeffrey lost his grip on the retractable leash handle. The dog ran off with the leash trailing behind it as Jeffrey immediately hurried after it, calling out while searching nearby paths and picnic tables. After several minutes, he still hadn't found it. Around the same time, Zach Conrad, 25, had been filming prank videos with two friends. They had already spent much of the afternoon recording reactions from strangers, but none of the clips had turned out the way they hoped. When Zach spotted the loose golden retriever wandering alone, he joked that pretending to walk off with it would finally get a big reaction. He clipped a spare leash onto the dog's collar, picked it up, and started walking away while his friends recorded from a distance. Personally, I've never understood involving someone's pet in a prank. That's one of those things that can go wrong a lot faster than people expect. Jeffrey eventually looked across the park and immediately recognized his dog in a stranger's arms. Relieved at first, began waving and jogging toward them, expecting the man to stop. Instead, Zach kept walking. Witnesses later said he glanced back more than once but continued moving, believing he still had time to reveal the prank before Jeffrey caught up. I get wanting a reaction for a video, but once someone is running toward you yelling about their dog, that's probably the moment to drop the joke. Before Jeffrey could reach them, the frightened dog struggled violently, slipped out of Zach's arms, and hit the ground awkwardly. It bolted straight across a park road, just as a pickup truck approached. The driver slammed on the brakes, stopping only a few feet short of the dog before it ran safely back toward the grass. By the time Jeffrey caught up, he believed a stranger had tried to steal his recovering dog and had nearly gotten it killed. Still gripping the heavy retractable leash handle, he swung it at Zach's head. The first blow knocked Zach onto the pavement. Jeffrey struck him several more times before nearby witnesses rushed in and pulled him away. The dog stayed close by, barking continuously as people gathered around the scene. A witness called for help while others remained with Zach until responders arrived. Investigators later recovered several phones from Zach's friends, all of which had been recording the prank. The videos showed the dog wandering loose, Zach attaching the spare leash, Jeffrey running toward them, and the dog breaking free into the road moments before the confrontation. Detectives also recovered the spare leash Zach had used, helping confirm the sequence of events. The footage made it clear Jeffrey had no indication the incident was intended as a prank. Zach died from multiple blunt force injuries to the head. The death was ruled a homicide. Jeffrey was initially charged with second-degree murder, but after investigators reviewed the videos and witness statements, prosecutors agreed to reduce the charge as part of a plea agreement. Jeffrey pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Pets aren't just property to most people, they're family, and people tend to react very differently when they think family is in danger. In Des Moines, Iowa, one homeowner had finally had enough of the late-night doorbell pranks, and this time, he wasn't planning to answer the door empty-handed. It was November 4th, 2015. Cold evenings had settled over Des Moines, Iowa, and most homes along one quiet residential street had settled into their usual nighttime routine. For one homeowner, though, nights had become something to brace for instead of enjoy. Gene McKinney was 62 years old and had lived in the same neighborhood for more than 20 years. He was retired, spent most of his time maintaining his home and yard, and appreciated a quiet routine. Over the previous several weeks, that routine had slowly disappeared. It started with late-night rounds of ding-dong ditch. Someone would ring the doorbell, pound on the front door, and disappear before Gene could even reach the port. At first, he brushed it off as neighborhood kids looking for a laugh. Then it happened again. Before long, it was several nights a week. Pranks also became more destructive. Firecrackers were tossed into his driveway after dark. Lawn decorations were knocked over. One morning, he found eggs covering his garage door, and another day, scattered trash had been thrown across the front yard. Sometimes it happened on weeknights. Other times, it was well after midnight midnight. Gene never knew when the next knock or explosion outside would come, only that sooner or later it probably would. I think what makes this different is that it wasn't just one bad night. It was the same problem showing up over and over until it became part of Gene's routine. Gene had become increasingly frustrated. He installed brighter outdoor lights, started checking outside whenever he heard a vehicle slow down, and complained that whoever was responsible always seemed to disappear seconds before he reached the port. Calling for help never led anywhere, because by the time anyone arrived, the teenagers were long gone. The group responsible included Dennis Mark Cooper, who was 18 years old. What started as a few harmless doorbell runs gradually turned into trying to outdo the last visit. Gene's house became their regular stop because they knew they would always get a reaction. If the porch light came on faster than the week before, they considered it a success. By the beginning of November, returning to Gene's house had become almost a tradition. Some jokes stopped being funny the moment they become part of someone else's everyday life. I don't think everyone realizes when they've crossed that line. On the evening of November 4th, Dennis and several friends drove back into the neighborhood, planning to set off a few small firecrackers near Gene's front walk before running back to their car. Gene was still awake when he heard a vehicle slow outside the house. Looking through the front window, he immediately recognized the same car he had seen circling the block on previous occasions. He stood there for several seconds watching several figures move across the front yard. By then, he had already convinced himself it was going to be another night of cleaning up someone else's idea of fun. Gene retrieved a shotgun, opened the front door, and stepped onto the porch. The group immediately turned and ran toward the street. Dennis was only a few strides from the sidewalk when Gene fired a single shot. Dennis collapsed in the front yard while the others kept running. One of them stopped several houses away to call for help, and neighbors who heard the gunshot came outside moments later. Responders arrived within minutes, but Dennis had suffered a fatal shotgun wound. Investigators recovered unexploded firecrackers near the front walkway, along with the spent shotgun shell and the shotgun Gene surrendered at the scene. Security cameras showed the group of young men running away when the shot was fired, while videos recovered from their phones documented several of the earlier pranks at Gene's house. Investigators concluded the group had returned intending to pull another prank, but the evidence also showed they were fleeing the property when Gene fired. He was arrested the following day and later stood trial. Jurors rejected his claim that he believed the group still posed an immediate threat and found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison. There's a reason people say you never really know what someone else is carrying. Sometimes you don't find out until it's too late. In Charlotte, North Carolina, a prankster pretending to ruin a man's newly restored classic car would soon find himself running for his life. We've still got a couple more stories to go, but first, if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to have you here. It was June 24th, 2018. Summer had settled over Charlotte, North Carolina, and downtown streets were crowded with people enjoying the weekend. Just a few blocks away, a local classic car gathering had drawn dozens of owners who had spent years restoring their vehicles. By late afternoon, many of them were beginning to head home. Stephen Jennings was 42 years old and worked as an electrician. Restoring cars had been his weekend hobby for years, and the muscle car he drove that afternoon was his biggest project yet. He had bought it in rough condition nearly 3 years earlier and slowly rebuilt it piece by piece, often saving for months before buying the next part. By the time it was finished, he had invested well over $30,000 into it. That day was the first time he had taken it to a public car show. I have a feeling most people don't even need to be car enthusiasts to understand that. After putting that much time and money into something, you're probably going to be protective of it. Not far from the parking garage, Gavin Porter, 21, and 2 friends had spent most of the afternoon filming prank videos. They had already recorded several harmless clips, but wanted something that would get a bigger reaction before calling it a day. One of them had brought a bucket filled with a washable liquid designed to look almost identical to fresh automotive paint. The plan was simple: splash it across an expensive-looking vehicle, film the owner's reaction for a few seconds, and then immediately reveal that it washed off with water. They wandered through the parking garage until Stephen parked and walked toward the exit. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Gavin hurried over to the car and dumped the liquid across the hood, windshield, and driver's side. Thick streams of bright color slowly ran down the freshly polished body panels, while one friend recorded from several parking spaces away. Stephen heard shouting behind him and turned around. From where he stood, it looked exactly like permanent paint covering the finish he had spent years restoring. Without stopping to think, he ran back toward the car. Gavin looked at Stephen's reaction, laughed, and started running before anyone had a chance to explain the prank. Personally, I think this is where the whole idea idea fell apart. If your plan depends on explaining the joke before someone catches you, you're leaving a lot to chance. Stephen chased Gavin out of the parking garage and onto the sidewalk. The pursuit continued for several blocks through busy downtown streets, with pedestrians stepping out of the way as both men ran through intersections and around parked cars. Witnesses later described Gavin looking over his shoulder several times while Stephen steadily closed the distance. The chase ended at a crowded intersection as the pedestrian signal was about to change. Gavin stepped into the crosswalk just as traffic began moving. Stephen caught up from behind and grabbed hold of him. The two men struggled briefly before Stephen forcefully shoved Gavin away. Gavin lost his footing, stumbled backward into an active traffic lane, and was struck by a delivery truck whose driver had braked immediately but could not stop in time. Several people rushed toward the intersection while others called for help. Officers closed part of the roadway as investigators documented the scene. Detectives collected surveillance footage from nearby businesses, traffic cameras, and the parking garage, allowing them to reconstruct nearly the entire chase. They also recovered the prank video from Gavin's friends, along with the bucket containing the washable liquid, which testing later confirmed had caused no permanent damage to Stephen's car. The investigation found that Stephen had intentionally shoved Gavin into the roadway during the confrontation. He was arrested several days later after detectives completed witness interviews and reviewed the available video evidence. Rather than taking the case to trial, Stephen accepted a plea agreement and admitted guilt to voluntary manslaughter. He was sentenced to 9 years in prison. One thing these stories keep reminding me is that you can rehearse every part of a prank. The one thing you'll never be able to rehearse is how the other person reacts when they think it's real. The final story takes us to Columbus, Ohio. It began with one grieving son watching what he believed were his mother's ashes being thrown away. It was October 22nd, 2017. Autumn had settled over Columbus, Ohio, and the cooler weather had brought plenty of people to a neighborhood park for weekend picnics and family gatherings. It looked like an ordinary Sunday afternoon, with children playing nearby and groups spread across the grass, enjoying the last stretch of mild weather before winter. Zachary Whitman was 34 years old and worked as an auto body technician. Earlier that summer, he had lost his mother after a long illness. Her cremated remains rested in an urn at his home, while relatives finalized plans for a private memorial. Friends later said he rarely spoke about his grief, but they knew how much the urn meant to him. Grief has a strange way of changing what feels valuable. Something that looks ordinary to everyone else can become completely irreplaceable to the person holding it. That afternoon, Zachary joined several friends at the park. Before leaving home, he had brought the urn with him because they planned to spend a quiet moment remembering his mother. While everyone was distracted setting up food and chairs, Shane Keller, 25, quietly switched the urn with an identical one that had been filled with fireplace ash. He and two friends planned to film Zachary's reaction before immediately revealing that the real urn had never been touched. A few minutes later, Zachary looked up and saw Shane walking toward the edge of a nearby pond, carrying what appeared to be the urn. From across the grass, he watched gray ash scatter across the water before Shane tossed the empty container onto the ground. Zachary ran toward the pond. By the time he reached the shoreline, the ash had already disappeared beneath the surface. He picked up the empty urn, stared at it for several seconds, then turned around and walked straight toward the parking lot. Shane and the others quickly realized Zachary had taken the prank seriously. They called after him and started following, intending to explain what had happened, but he got into his truck and drove away before they could catch him. To them, the prank was already over. To Zachary, it had just happened. Not every bad reaction looks explosive. Sometimes, it's the person who doesn't react at all that you should be paying attention to. Later that evening, Zachary drove to Shane's house. Shane was inside a detached garage working on an older pickup truck when Zachary arrived. The two men began arguing almost immediately before the confrontation turned physical. Investigators later found overturned tools, broken equipment, and bloodstains on the concrete floor, indicating a struggle had taken place. Shane eventually lost consciousness after suffering multiple blows to the head. Instead of calling for help, Zachary lowered the garage door, started the pickup truck, and left through a side entrance. The engine continued running inside the enclosed garage for several hours, allowing deadly carbon monoxide to build. The truck eventually stopped after running out of fuel. Shane's family became concerned the following morning after repeated calls went unanswered. They found the garage closed, opened a side door, and discovered Shane lying motionless beside the truck before calling for help. Investigators determined the death was not accidental. Fresh head injuries, bloodstains inside the garage, the running vehicle, and neighborhood surveillance cameras showing Zachary's truck arriving the previous evening all pointed to a deliberate act. Detectives also recovered the prank video from Shane's friends, along with the original urn containing Zachary's mother's cremated remains, confirming the ashes scattered into the pond had been ordinary fireplace ash. Phone records showed Shane had also attempted to call Zachary several times shortly after the prank, supporting witness statements that the group had tried to explain what had happened before he left the park. Zachary was charged with murder. He was later convicted after prosecutors argued the evidence showed he had intentionally incapacitated Shane, sealed the garage, and left him inside with the truck running. The court sentenced him to life in prison with the possibility of parole. This one stayed on my mind for a while. Grief is already hard enough without someone turning one of the last things you have left of a loved one into a joke. Seriously, grow up.